3 minutes after 10 is the time, and welcome. Delighted to have your company today, not least because I'm not really clear on what we're going to talk about. I think we'll start with the leadership threat to Boris Johnson, which wasn't actually planned until Andrea Leadsome's letter dropped a few moments ago. It's not a letter of no confidence. It's well, I don't know. Should we get Theo in early today? Can we summon the Usherwood nice and early? Thank you. No, he won't be expecting that. He normally goes for a cup. My goodness me, that was quick. Look at this, bounding into the studio like a latter-day Tigger. Bear with me for a moment, Theo. Very good morning to you. It's lovely to see you looking so chipper. Yeah. I'll turn to Theo shortly, just to bring you up to speed. I'd call it a shot across the bows, what Andrea Leadsom has done this morning, rather than an actual pledge to prime the cannons and aim directly for the flagship of the fleet. But the numbers are swelling, and they're not all... what's a polite way of putting it? They're not all acting out of naked self-interest. Some of them are acting out of principle, although it's quite hard to pick the ones that are. Let's go for the obvious ones. I'd say Caroline Noakes, Tobias Ellwood, perhaps, Jeremy Wright, although I think he has a tiny constituency as well. I'm intrigued by the size of the majority and the alacrity with which they have revealed that they're submitting their letters of no confidence. Andrew Bridgen, as ever, manages to look ridiculous, whatever the story is. His letter goes in, it comes out again, in again, out again, in, out. I suppose we should all be grateful that he doesn't shake it all about, but he is the hokey-cokey of Conservative MPs in human form. Brexit hardman Steve Baker, you might think, is a strange one to be on the disloyal list, but not when you look into his curious character and background, a man who turned down a junior ministry a couple of years ago because he didn't think it was commensurate with his enormous talents. Brexit hardman Steve Baker being the only man on the planet holding the view that he is possessed of enormous talents. David Davis, probably a slightly weirder one, but Davis has always been a queer fish when it comes to constitutional issues and probity. He resigned his seat once on a slightly kind of obscure point of principle that he felt demanded that he resign his seat and then fight it again in a by-election. But Andrea Leadsom is quite interesting. Not an actual vote of no confidence, but, as I've suggested, a shot across the bows. Is that an accurate description, Theo Usherwood?
I think it's a bit more than a shot across the bows, actually. I think, to disagree with you, James, just ever so slightly... it's more. It's basically saying that the Prime Minister, she doesn't obviously want to call for him to go because, of course, sometimes MPs like to just not to go that extra yard in terms of being outright in calling for the Prime Minister to go. That's happened. There's form for that. But she is saying the key sentence: each of my Conservative colleagues and I must now individually work on what is the right course of action that will restore confidence in our government. And I think if you look at that sentence, she is saying the Prime Minister cannot be the person that restores the confidence when it comes to the integrity of this government, and somebody else is needed.
You're right, because she's not saying he must.
No.
She's saying we must.
Exactly.
A crucial distinction. That is why we pay you the big bucks.
So they need to make a decision about who is the credible person with the integrity to bring back the public's trust in the government to do its job, and that Boris Johnson isn't the person to be able to do that. Now, just looking at the numbers, I want to refer you to, it was a tweet from Ian Dale put out from an unknown Tory MP, if I may, but just to give him his dues on this, because he said in the south it is politics that's costing, that is hitting the Conservatives. In the north it's the economy. And there's Joe Armitage from Global Counsel did a spreadsheet, and he found that of the 39 MPs most at risk from the Lib Dems, these are Tory MPs most at risk from the Lib Dems at the next election, 7 have already submitted letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister.
That's quite a lot, isn't it?
So we've got people like Elliot Coburn, who came out yesterday. Coburn,
he's the youngest, I think, isn't he?
Down in Carshalton and Wallington, near Croydon. And then, of course, we've got Paul Holmes down in Eastleigh. He actually resigned from his position as a PPS to Priti Patel in the Home Office, feeling the pressure amongst Conservative voters on the doorstep who are saying, I thought the Conservatives stood for low taxes, that they stood for integrity, that they stood for decency in public life.
Also, they may not be saying this yet, but they were promised that Brexit would reduce the cost of living, that it would mean that food and fuel costs would actually come down. I think have we not got Jacob Rees-Mogg on tape saying that food and fuel costs would come down as a consequence of Brexit? They may not be joining those particular dots yet, but they will. They will.
But it's the cost of living where in the north of England, which is worrying Tory MPs in the north of England, and that's why you haven't necessarily seen the same level of rebellion and uprising against the Prime Minister from those particular MPs, because their voters, it would seem, are not so fussed about Partygate, that they are more aligned with the view that it might be now time to move on from Partygate, that they're more worried about feeling the pinch in their pockets around the kitchen table.
Whereas on the doorsteps in the south, and Tiverton, the looming by-election in Tiverton could be very interesting on this.
I think
because we can call it Partygate, but it's actually the blatant law-breaking and lying by a Prime Minister, isn't it? Partygate becomes, I think, in danger of being euphemistic in these contexts, because it is in many ways more important, or as important, than the cost of living crisis, because it gives you a genuine crisis at the heart of conservatism. So the red wall voters are not dyed-in-the-wool conservatives. They are clearly a movable constituency, because they moved from Labour to Conservative in 2019. People who perceive themselves as Conservative as part of their political identity do not think that political identity can accommodate a lying lawbreaker in Downing Street, which is why Conservative MPs on the ground in the South East and the South West and the South are getting that a lot on the doorstep. So it's a different type of voter. It's not geography, it's heritage.
Exactly. And also, I'd just say with what's going to happen down in Tiverton and Honiton, it's only anecdotal, and this is just what I've been picking up, but the Lib Dems, it's a big majority. It's 20,000 odd majority there that Conservatives are protecting. And if the Lib Dems manage to take that seat, it would be an absolute hammer blow for other Conservatives in Lib Dem seats who will be worried that if they can take that seat, this is the Neil Parish tractor porn seat.
Is that what it's known? Is that the official the Neil Parish tractor porn seat? I like that.
But that if they can take that seat, then that brings into play so many other Conservative seats for the Liberal Democrats that, of course, we could end up in a situation where, say, Davies' party at the next election goes back up to where it's standing under the late Charles Kennedy and Nick Clegg going back into the noughties.
So you've got 40 MPs either calling for a vote of no confidence or publicly expressing dissatisfaction, fairly deep dissatisfaction.
27 have called for the Prime Minister to go ASAP, and then 13, and I'm putting Andrea Ledsam's letter, by the way, in the second category.
Yes, of course.
So that brings up to 40, and of course the magic number, James, is 54. If we hit that number, then Sir Graham Brady, he doesn't have to do it immediately. He can show a little bit of discretion.
There is the Platy-Jubes coming up as well.
So, we're not going to have any letters then, the Jubilee.
Yeah, the Platy-Jubes. That's what the young people are calling it.
So we've got the Jubilee celebrations coming up, James. They start on Thursday. It would be bad form for anybody to be grandstanding with letters or calls on. So it's basically the next 48 hours is crucial. Where do we get to? And then Parliament, of course, resumes on Monday. The question is also, do they decide, those who are rebelling now, to go for it now? And there would be a concern that, given Boris Johnson has 173 on the government payroll, taking into account all the bag carriers, ministers, cabinet ministers.
And I think, without being unkind, a significant of the more prominent ministers, the sort of more household namey ones, are considerably unlikely to get jobs under any other sentient human being, never mind any other Conservative regime. You've got members of the cabinet who, frankly, don't seem fit to lace the shoes of previous Conservative ministers. Let's not be partisan about this. And you know, one can't imagine them getting promoted from a typing pool, never mind getting into the cabinet. But under Boris Johnson, of course, loyalty is more important than talent, probity, integrity, understanding or knowledge. Not naming any names, Nadine Dorries.
You're making the point that some of the cabinet ministers are sort of topped out at
Topped out, you're so polite. Yes, topped out, Theo, is exactly what I was suggesting.
Topped out at how far they're going to go in their political careers. Yes, and also there are those in more junior ranks who still wouldn't expect to go very far under a new leader. So there is that patronage element to it.
You've got self-interest on both sides. You've got self-interest of the electoral calculations of slim majorities versus self-interest of career advancement or career retention of people who might be more safe in their seats.
But it is a secret ballot, and of course there is the opportunity, if you and that 173 I mentioned is only 7 short of how many Boris Johnson needs in order to win that vote of no confidence. And of course, if he were to win that vote of no confidence, he would be protected for a year and he'd be able to fight the next general election. The point I was just going to make very quickly on the by-elections in Tiverton and Honiton and Wakefield is that if he were to lose both, the Conservatives were to lose both, then that would be potentially much more damaging, because it would say to Conservative MPs, he is now an electoral liability. It is proven at the ballot box he is an electoral liability. We saw, of course, what happened up in North Shropshire at the end of last year. Therefore, you are going to lose your seat. If you want to have any hope of keeping your seat, then we need to change the front man of the band.
If I were to hold your feet to the fire, do you think they are as near as damn it to the 54? Because I think they only had 27 public when Theresa May breached the threshold, and they've now got...
But it was a lower 48.
And right, okay. So the numbers are more or less the same between public and private. So if the arithmetic tallies with Theresa May's experience, where Boris Johnson, ironically enough, was one of the key movers behind the scenes, mounting that putsch or accelerating that putsch, then they've probably got the 54 by the end of the week at least.
Yes, I don't think the 54 is almost in question. I think the 54 is there.
Right.
The question is, can they win that vote of no confidence? Can they get the 180 they need? Because if they don't get the 180 they need, Boris Johnson gets the chance to fight the next election, and they'll all be expected, having had this leadership challenge, to rally round him and support him into the next election.
But you're holed below the waterline, aren't you, in the party? If it's close, if it's any way close, your leadership, your authority is completely destroyed.
But he's not.
Well, he won't go anywhere because he's a narcissist. But in terms of tradition and history and legacy and statistics and maths and precedent, I mean,
but to be fair to Boris Johnson, this was a precedent set by Theresa May back in the end of 2018, because it was always the case that were there to be a leadership challenge and you were to have a third of the party move against you, you'd look at the numbers and say, well, I can't possibly lead the party if 40% are running against me. I'll resign. But Theresa May, of course, set the precedent that said, actually, we're in the middle of Brexit. It's all very complicated. I need to stay on as leader in the national interest. I'm going to make it. I'm going to make it a +1 vote. But that doesn't apply to
Johnson, because he's got Brexit done and it's all going brilliantly.
So
poor old Theo. Chloe's very pleased today. She said, let me get this absolutely right, because it tickled me pink. I live for Theo Usherwood's bemusement at Mr. James O'B's jokes on LBC. Have you not heard Plattijubes before?
No.
I should have run that by you before we came on air. So all the young people are calling their Jubilee Plattijubes. What are you doing for Plattijubes, bruv? That kind of thing.
Plattijubes.
Plattijubes, cuz. Seriously. Having a banging Plattijubes. All killer, no filler. Going down the... I don't know, roller disco on Plattijubes or something like that. Are we good?
Yeah, I think that's it.
Are you going to be coming back in? Do you think that more fireworks may go off? What would you say with what we've got 2 and 3/4 hours to go?
I think there's a better than evens chance.
By 1 o'clock today,
we'll have another.
We could have another 1 or 2 on the list. Although I have to refer you, Patrick Maguire of the Times points out,
and he's very good.
And he is very good. And you were also right to correct me or to contradict me on the shot across the bows. It is a little bit more than that, but it is an oddly... he writes, what even is this? It's not on headed paper. It is on headed paper, but it isn't a letter to anyone in particular, least of all Graham Brady. It's critical, but it doesn't actually commit to doing anything. Come on. In response to Andrea Leadsom's criticism. It's a little bit... It's a bit of a sort of...
It's a bit meh.
A bit meh. A bit empty. A bit wibbly, I think, is the technical term. But of course, Leadsom would be one of those people who before you go, we're very late. Do you want to stay around for a tiny bit longer? And we'll just have a look at who might be throwing their hat into the ring, actually, because very, very few people who go into politics don't somewhere deep inside think that they should be Prime Minister. Even, and I kid you not, Marc Francois. 20 minutes after 10, here's something that's never happened before on the programme. I'd like to issue a special message to Conservative MPs. If you come on, and I mean this seriously, it's going to sound like I'm joking, but I'm not. I'd love you to use the platform I can offer you, the most popular commercial radio talk show in the history of the United Kingdom. I don't know for how much longer I'll be able to sustain that claim, which is why I should probably stop pointing it out on it. Well, I only do it once a week. I'm very careful. But if you wanted to avail yourself of this platform to announce that you have submitted a letter of no confidence, you'd be guaranteed coverage on a scale that you simply don't get by releasing letters on social media or just doing it all in print. And obviously Global now is a massive player in the radio business, and you'd be on Classic FM, you'd be on Smooth, would they get on Capital?
Capital would
Probably get played out on Capital, you'd be on Heart FM. So, I mean, a message for Conservative MPs, think how cool your kids would think you are if your letter of no confidence announcement was played out on Capital Extra, for example, or on Heart FM, or indeed Classic FM with Alexander Armstrong, the presenter of Pointless. We've got so much talent in this building now, and if you were to choose this programme to make your announcement, then I can guarantee you more coverage than you would get by doing it in almost any other format. And of course the BBC would clip it up as well, so it would get played out on all their stations as well. But crucially, you'd be playing out on all the stations that the kids listen to. And speaking of kids, Tim in Croydon has been in touch to say, as a young person, nobody calls it platitubes. Please stop. Shut up, Grandad. So, Theo, what sort of people might be throwing that? I mean, because I think Leadsom would still think she's got a chance, wouldn't she? She had an odd experience last time. She gave an unfortunate interview to the Daily Telegraph in which she seemed to be suggesting that because Theresa May didn't have any children, she'd be a rubbish Prime Minister.
Yeah, I just love the idea, firstly, of Drake followed by Tom Tugendhat on Capital Extra.
If you're listening,
am I doing
Tom,
the you thing right?
If you're listening, Tom, I can make it happen.
Who are we looking at? Right, Rishi Sunak's out of it. I think that's safe to say. The Chancellor hasn't got a chance.
His reversal has been spectacular.
Yeah.
I mean, he was at the top of the list, there or thereabouts, alongside Liz Truss and Ben Wallace and a couple of others. And now he's very, very near the bottom. He's not quite as unpopular as the Prime Minister is among Tory members, but he's very close to being.
Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, has quite a well-developed team for a leadership challenge around her. And I think you could expect Liz Truss to run for leader if there was to be an opening. There have been questions amongst Conservative MPs about whether she has the gravitas, she has the ability to do the very top job and to be Prime Minister. Other cabinet names we've heard talked about, people like Nadeem Zahawi, the Education Secretary. I'd heard talk.
He's a relatively clean skin, isn't he, as they say?
From what I understand, he has similar concerns to Rishi Sunak because he's also very wealthy,
right? And
that he could fall into the trap of.
He famously claimed expenses for heating his stables, which
he's separately very wealthy as well.
When times are good, that kind of thing is chaff. When times are bad, it's going to be kind of hard to sell him to the people we were talking about.
Exactly. So I think Nadeem Zahawi is a bit more of an outlier. I think somebody who hasn't been discussed and has floated well below any radar.
These are the people that interest me the most.
Ben Wallace.
Okay.
So
he's been discussed a bit.
But he's got the highest approval rating. He's got the highest approval rating of any cabinet minister. And he's been discussed a bit, but he's not been in that sort of first tranche of MPs to put their, to be openly talked about.
Because he's got a very senior job. So, as has Truss, so they will be watching very, very closely. Let's test your knowledge here. Why do I always think of toothache at times like this?
Is it something to do with, what's that programme?
No.
No, it's not that programme, no.
It's to John Major. So after Thatcher had fallen and people like Hurd and Heseltine were the favourites and they were agitating, and John Major just dropped off the face of the earth and said he'd had wisdom tooth surgery. He just disappeared completely, watching and choosing his moment before pouncing. And it's a reminder, as indeed was the election of David Cameron to the leadership of the Conservative Party, it's a reminder that the best laid plans of mice and political correspondence gang after Glay. It's quite often someone who comes in from the outside rather than the anointed successor, which in Cameron's case was David Davis, believe it or not.
And it brought back what's the old House of Cards. You might say that, but I couldn't possibly comment.
Yes.
The protagonist in that program, name escapes me. But do we have one of those characters who just isn't? Nobody's talked about, suddenly rises to the top. On the back benches, Tom Tugendhat has been, as I was joking just now, he's been talked about and has openly said that he would like to lead the party as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. He's not very popular amongst Conservative MPs.
Okay.
And just to remind you of the process, anybody can throw their name into the ring to stand, and then it's done an X Factor style.
Penny Mordaunt?
Penny Mordaunt's, yes, she's up.
Making moves, isn't she? It has been suggested already. Mark Harper.
Former Chief Whip.
Yeah, from the backbenches.
Brexit, part of the COVID recovery group, European research group, well organised, but he only appeals to a caucus. And
Right.
this was the point that a number 10 source was making to me this morning, is that there is no definitive plan. And when Boris Johnson took over, he had a plan to chuck Chequers, which was Theresa May's idea for a UK-wide backstop. So we didn't have the border down the middle of the Irish Sea, but it was unacceptable to the Brexit wing of the party. So he appealed to them on that basis. But there's nobody at the moment rising to the top who would keep everybody happy. And that's the number 10. That's the number 10 playbook at the moment is, okay, who's got the alternative plan? Who's got the alternative vision? We've now, and this is the idea, dealt with Sue Gray. If we want to deal with Sue Gray,
yes.
Who would want to commit regicide and do this, go through this masochistic process, as it was put to me, of trying to pick a new leader who can unite the party and still have the appeal on Hartlepool High Street in 2024, when people can't afford to heat their homes and go and
a little bit of stardust is what you're talking about.
And
You've
nobody
upset
has
the rain. You've upset the rain. Liz Truss doesn't have the gravitas. Ha ha ha! Look at the Joker in the top seat now. Why is it that only women don't have the gravitas?
She spent
Theo,
£500,000.
I like you, but come on now.
But Penny Mordaunt does, I'd say. But Liz Truss has made mistakes such as £500,000 on a flight, on chartering on the ministerial plane to Australia. Whether that was really necessary. She made that slip up when which they had to row back on when she made those threats towards Russia at the very start of the conflict, where she spoke out of turn, and that had to be backtracked. So there is concern that amongst Conservative MPs that she hasn't impressed in the same way that, okay, I get Lorraine's point, by the way.
Of course.
And it's a fair point, that somebody like Ben Wallace has done.
Penny Mordaunt's odds have come in from 20-1 to 9-1 in the last couple of weeks, Neil tells us. And on that theme, George writes, it feels like football transfer deadline day. We need Jim White going frantic, telling us the latest Tory MP to hand in their letters. We may as well take you, while we have you, all the way up to the news, because a couple of questions coming in. Can a cabinet minister submit a letter of no confidence without resigning their post in cabinet? So they
collective
can't.
Responsibility. Collective responsibility. They are part of the government. It's the Paul Holmes question down in Eastleigh. He was part of the government because he was a PPS, the bag carrier for Priti Patel. He had to resign in order to say that he would speak out against Boris Johnson. You're signed up if you're in the government. They can do what they did to Margaret Thatcher. The process was slightly different back then, and they could go and say to him, "Now you need to go."
And is there? I think I know the answer to this, but they want to hear it from you. Is there anything to stop former prime ministers from throwing their hat into the leadership ring?
No.
It's unlikely to happen.
No,
Theresa May is the only
May.
one who would fall into that category, still in the House of Commons.
Yes. It's very unusual, though. What I would say, and we haven't yet heard, and this would be a big moment, but it's very unusual for a former leader to publicly come out and criticise. Now, if Theresa May was to say she'd submitted a letter of no confidence in Boris Johnson, that would be massive. That would be huge. And the closest we came,
I mean, she could have done already.
But if she was to publicly come out and
there's
say
not a lot of love lost there, is there? Given the way in which Boris Johnson said no Conservative leader could contemplate doing the thing that Theresa May couldn't contemplate doing, but Boris Johnson then went on to
He's been pretty rude to her in the House of Commons as well, standing up and walking out when she's got up to speak and things like that.
So a lot to watch. Here's a final little message for you. Finally, the Theo Usherwood show from 10 a.m. has arrived. I wish the other bloke would stop interrupting.
I think it's the interruptions that make it, James.
Well, I'm not so sure. You may be interrupting me later today, because it seems quite likely that a little bit more movement will occur. Certainly between now and all bets being off come Thursday, when Platty Jubes, of course, kicks in. Although Mark's been in touch to say Gareth has been in touch to say my 14-year-old sister has just confirmed that she has never heard anyone say Platty Jubes. Yeah. Okay, boomer. Here's Rebecca Cook with the headlines. It is 10:34 and I've done it again. Oops, indeed. I've done it again, because there is nothing harder in this business than launching the phone-in show. Launching a phone-in off the back of half an hour of taking no calls. But I thought Theo Ushwood was on particularly scintillating form, and there is indeed a lot to talk about. I forgot to mention Radio X, another one of our stablemates here at Global Towers. So Conservative MPs keen to announce their letter of no confidence could be on Radio X by tea time. It could be on with Johnny Vaughan, for heaven's sake. Just imagine how much kudos that will have with the kids. Maybe slightly overselling it there, I'm not sure. But the time now is 10:34, and the reasons I would want you to ring in now include, what would you do? And it's a genuine question, this. I've got another guest booked in 10 minutes, actually, because there's an astonishing story coming out of America about the state of the British pound. The Bank of America issuing a warning that, understandably, is going to be largely ignored by 80% of the Brexit British media. Because it mentions Brexit. So the Bank of America is mentioning Brexit now in its analyses of the British economic situation and the state of our currency, but the Prime Minister never does. Weird that. So you could get on really quickly if you are quick to ring in. What would you do? So I've got two questions for you. The first is a bit simple. What would you do if you were a Conservative MP, and why? Crucially, why? And that leads into the second question. I was looking at the case of Alexander Lebedev last night, the former KGB spy who has been sanctioned in Canada now. He's on Canada's sanctions list, Ukraine-related sanctions list, for, and I quote, being a key member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. I'll say that again. A key member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. This is according to the Canadian government, who have, as I say, elected to sanction him in the way that we have sanctioned many other Russian oligarchs and plutocrats in this country. Boris Johnson went to his 60th birthday party the day after the 2019 general election. A man who has been put on the sanctions list in Canada and described as a key member of Putin's inner circle. A few months later, after that birthday party that Boris Johnson went to with his wife the day after the 2019 general election, Johnson gave his son, Evgeny Lebedev, a peerage, a seat in the House of Lords, against the advice of security services. And he still refuses to publish that advice. So I guess what I'm asking you is, why now? What is it about the current collection of circumstances that has focused the minds of Conservative MPs? Why are they doing it now? Hit the numbers now. You really will get through. There is never an easier time to get through to this programme than when I've just done half an hour without taking a call. But the quality filter will still be high. I'm not going to let on any old flotsam and jetsam. Those days are long behind. There's plenty of other opportunities to get on in the course of the morning, but not between 10 and 1. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Why are they doing it now? And let's take Theo's analysis and look at what I prefer to call the law-breaking and lying, but which obviously is inevitably also known as Partygate, versus cost of living. And he mentioned Ian Dale, who you really should listen to as well, particularly at times like this when there is trouble afoot in the Conservative Party. Ian's contacts are impeccable and his analysis is quite often scintillating. So when Ian talks about the difference between the North and the South, the cost of living questions in the north of England, and I would say probity as opposed to political questions about probity and integrity in the south of England, which do you consider to be more important? The failure really to tackle the cost of living crisis, the failure to do anything meaningful in that? And there is an astonishing story on page 3 of the Times today about Johnson and his wife apparently hiring 4 extra staff at Chequers, such as the extent of their demands. And this story appears to be undenied by the Cabinet Office. It's a story about a member of staff apparently feeling that she had little choice but to leave after falling out with Carrie Johnson. The headline is "Housekeeper at Chequers Forced Out by Carrie Clash." But the detail in the tale that caught my eye was about the 4 extra members of staff, up to 4 extra members of staff being hired in the midst of a cost of living crisis, because the demands of the Johnsons are are so high, and this follows years of cuts happening to staff at Chequers, a programme started by David Cameron, because obviously it doesn't look good. I don't want to call them servants, I don't know what the technical term is, but if Boris Johnson has been hiring servants on the public purse while the country faces a cost of living crisis, that, to my untutored eye, is arguably a much bigger story than a personality clash with a housekeeper. And then you factor in the Partygate report, which found that staff had been treated appallingly at Downing Street while Johnson was presiding over a culture of carousing and corruption, that you get perhaps a picture of consistent entitlement and contempt for ordinary working people. But that's just an interesting story about where priorities lie. It's cost the taxpayer about £916,000 a year towards the upkeep of Chequers. So that story was very interesting. But I just want to know what you think is more important, whether it is, or what you think. If you were a Conservative MP, what would be the straw that broke the back of your particular political camel, all right? What do you think would be grounds for submitting a letter of no confidence? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. And this is unsigned, possibly wisely. It says, James, you're going about this all wrong. If you want to get Tory MPs on your show, offer them some dodgy Russian money. Well, I couldn't, and B, I don't think that's actually fair to a significant number. I don't know if I could say a vast majority, but a significant number of Conservative MPs, whether they've gone public with their disapproval of Johnson or not, a significant number of them will be just as disgusted as everybody else is by the way in which the country has fallen so far so fast, thanks to the installation of a spectacularly unsuitable man at the very top of our pyramid of power, who then, of course, proceeded to surround himself with spectacularly ill-equipped, unqualified and unsuitable men and women in his cabinet, because the only qualification you need now is complete sycophancy. 10:41 is the time. Paul's in Manningtree. Paul, what do you reckon?
Hey there, James.
Hello,
how you
Paul.
doing?
Very well, mate. What would you do?
Well, the answer to what would I do if I was a Conservative MP, I would definitely be thinking more about the people that have voted me in, rather than the bozo leader that is, leading the party. Yeah. I think that the main reason is, during the whole pandemic, or 2020, if we can remember that, was the idea of people on Twitter, MPs on Twitter, and saying, we must do what's right, we must...
Yes.
Backing up what Boris was saying that we should do every night, and this is the right thing to do, there's sacrifices. And now he's done what he's done.
And it's time to move on. Everyone should just forget about that.
Yes, move on. And I kind of feel it's if they believe in the people of their constituency and values, then that's what they should be doing, rather than the whole, it doesn't matter, because
it is. I do know, you put it perfectly, actually. It's a pirouette, isn't it? It's a pivot of spectacular proportions, because they've gone from dedicating significant amounts of energy, political capital and time to insisting that the rules are very important, and insisting that everybody obeys them, and insisting that that is the quickest way out of lockdown, to responding to news that the Prime Minister was riding roughshod over those rules for the entire duration of the crisis, as was pretty much everybody in close proximity to him. Now suddenly they don't matter. You're not moving on. Everyone keeps telling you to move on. Why aren't you moving on?
Because I have morals. and I believe that it's sort of, when if someone is asking somebody to do something, they have to do that themselves at least. The other part is as well that I truly believe that, quite a morbid thing to say maybe, but like the day that we die, I want someone to remember me for the good that I've done, know, and I feel that the day that these MPs resign or they, retire or they pass away, they'll be remembered for the things that they stood for. And the idea of that they are okay with that is just, the idea of move on.
Well, I'm going to say it again. I've said it several times already this week, but I'm going to say it again. If you stand for nothing, you will fall for anything. And a lot of Conservative MPs should be considering that slightly adapted quote of Alexander Hamilton's at this time. Paul, thank you. Mo's in Birmingham. Mo, what would you like to say?
Well, if I was a Conservative MP, I'd be thinking about self-preservation.
Yeah.
I think
Is that a good
more
thing
than
or a bad thing? I mean, you should prioritise party above self-preservation or principle above self-preservation, but we're all human, aren't we?
Not this carnation of the Conservative Party, which, you ask 100 people, nobody will actually know what this Conservative Party stands for.
Well, you say that. I've got the 9 brilliant Brexit ideas that have come from the 2,000 that were submitted to when Jacob Rees-Mogg asked the British people to do his job, when he said, you need to suggest to me. Anyway, I'll share that later in the programme. It may change your view of what the Conservative Party stands for. For example, they're pledging to make Hoovers more powerful. That's
going to help me deal with this crisis of cost of living at the moment.
Well, you could certainly clean up the mess that's been made.
Well, I think James, the polling, I think, is really bad, and I think the Conservative Party has been obsessed about self-polling. I think that YouGov poll that came out, and YouGov has been traditionally a polling organisation that has been sympathetic towards the Conservatives.
But their polling has. I don't think there's anything sinister going on, but they do generally.
No, I don't think there's anything
they
sinister,
tack towards the findings that will be easier reading for the Conservatives.
Correct. And I think the fact that they are predicting.
Do you want me to get that? Do you want me to get that?
Oh, sorry.
Is it the doorbell?
No, it is. Yes.
Well, go on, see who it is. Oh wait.
No, that's all right.
You've got to get it. Otherwise, you can't have that going on in the background. Well, it's not something dodgy, is it? You haven't got an escort turning up or something like that.
No, nothing like that.
All right. It's a bit early, Mo.
Yeah, it is. It is a bit early. I think it's just the scale of defeat. The fact that MPs like Steve Baker, Ian Duncan Smith, Dominic Raab could lose their
Boris Johnson, according to the polling you're referring to.
Potentially. I think it's that, and the fact that we've got 2 by-elections coming up with 2 completely different profile seats, Tiverton and Wakefield, and the bookies don't get them wrong. They're predicting victories for the Lib Dems and Labour. Once people turn off the Conservatives and break a habit of a lifetime and go and vote for the other side, Labour saw it at the last election, they'll do it again, and that is what the Conservatives. And it could be
that we hit a point where their best chance of avoiding that outcome is by getting rid of the man in charge. There was one piece, I must dig out where I read it, comparing him to Corbyn and saying it doesn't matter what policy announcements he comes up with now, the toxicity of the brand will undermine all of them. So the pounds and ounces nonsense may once have played well with the base, but his brand is so badly damaged that nothing he comes up with is actually going to impress the people that he needs to impress. Mo, thank you. Phone lines are open. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I'll probably continue with this element of the phone-in programme after the 11 o'clock news, but after this interlude, keen to find out more about the rude awakening that sterling is in for, according to analysts at the Bank of America, which isn't quite the august national institution that the Bank of England is, as I understand it, but it's certainly something that we should be paying attention to. 10:47 is the time. 10:51 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where there are a few journalists in this country whose words I watch a lot more closely than other journalists. In fact, I watch their words more closely than I watch my own. And one of them is Lionel Barber, the former editor of the Financial Times, and now, of course, part of the global stable. And he tweeted this morning, the most underreported story this morning, sterling turning into an emerging market currency, warns Wall Street Bank. And the Wall Street Bank in question is Bank of America, which I think is the second biggest in the United States. And Lionel joins me now to explain a little bit further. Just to clarify at the beginning, this isn't the same as the Bank of England, Lionel. We should be clear about that. It is, I think, second only to Morgan Chase in America and the 8th biggest bank in the world, but it doesn't have a quasi-governmental role or something that would make it, because you say Bank of America, you think that must be the American equivalent of the Bank of England, but it isn't.
No, James, it's Bank of America Merrill Lynch, actually, to give its full name. It merged. It's one of the top Wall Street banks, and they have big teams that analyze currencies. And this is where the warning came that essentially the pound sterling is looking a bit like the Mexican peso, and perhaps we should try and understand why.
I mean, you use the peso as an example, but I mean, they really do compare it to an emerging market-like currency, which is, I mean, even I, with my really quite poor grasp of broader economic matters, that does sound terrifying.
Well, what it means, James, is that we're going to see a bit like yo-yo behavior of the currency. Now, sterling does move up and down, but the essence of this warning is it's been sliding and is going to continue to slide, according to this analyst, Kamal Shah. Now, he has a bit of form, by the way. I mean, he was warning about sterling 2 years ago. But what's made it even more acute now is, look, sterling is around 126 to the dollar. In March, it was 142 or so. It's also been falling against, moving against the euro. And the reason, and this is where all the noise, James, that we've been hearing about Partygate and policy maneuvers, this is the price, in my view, and Kamal Shah's, of an unserious government, an unpredictability in the Johnson government's economic policy.
Because, for example, action on interest rates is motivated by political expediency rather than economic wisdom.
Well, I think, again, I would separate that because the Bank of England does come in for serious criticism.
Yes, it does.
And as you and I know, it is independent. In fact, it's 25 years independent. But it was behind the curve late last year. And now you've had some pretty apocalyptic warnings by the governor about inflation. So the Bank of England gets it in the neck from Mr. Shah. But he also talks about the costs of Brexit and instability, not understanding where the country is going and the economic framework. And, you know, you've been on the show, you've been showing this with or displaying this with the windfall tax. Suddenly it's not on, then it is on. So people don't know where the economic policy and policy in general is going.
We are concerned, he said, that the increasing politicisation of UK policy undermines the pound in ways that would appear EM-like.
Well, James, I mean, when you see the latest move on imperial weights and measures, which this is the kind of thing you get in, you know, Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Right.
It's sort of banana republic type behavior. It's meaningless. And also, James, by the way, what about the cost for all the retailers? This isn't factored in. Nobody talks about it. But these analysts on Wall Street are looking at these kind of unserious policy announcements, and they're punishing the pound in financial markets. They're treating us like an emerging market.
You mentioned Brexit, which I think makes you a fellow rarity in much of the British media at the moment, even in this context. I mean, this fellow, Kamal Sharma, pulls no punches, does he? He gives the bank a bit of a coating, suggests its credibility has suffered over its failure to acknowledge the full impact of Brexit on the UK economy, something that probably wouldn't have happened under Mark Carney, who became something of a bête noire for Brexiters, but then goes further and talks about the supply challenges, most notably Brexit, as a result of which each rate hike has been met by a confusing communication strategy as the bank finds it increasingly difficult to sell rate hikes on its merits. I don't want to lead you into unfair territory, and of course the Bank of England has been independent for 25 years, but it looks to me as if there's almost I mean, you've got a governor of the Bank of England who sits in stark contrast to his predecessor when it comes to the wisdom of Brexit or the wiseness of Brexit. If Mark Carney was still in the job, would we be hearing different messages from the top of the Bank of England?
I think Mark Carney would be pretty careful about criticising now. He'd be saying, it's happened, we've got to deal with it. What he would be doing, James, perhaps, is being a bit more clear about the costs and consequences. The disruption to the supply chain, the extra costs. If you look at inflation in Britain, we are worse off than on the continent. The government says otherwise. It's not true. We have serious inflation near double digit. It feels like the 1970s. Governor Carney, ex-Governor Carney, I think would be a little bit more open about that and not just bury it like the present government.
And while we're doing counterfactuals, what would more responsible government look like if they were not faffing about with pounds and ounces and doing the hokey cokey on the windfall tax and, of course, facing a potential leadership challenge or a vote of no confidence? What would strong and stable, there's a phrase we haven't heard for a while, what would strong and stable government look like in specifically in this context?
Well, I was going to do my Scottish accent for you.
Oh, here we go.
I mean, Gordon Brown.
Yes.
Strong and stable, predictable, golden rules. I mean, look, it's difficult right now. There are economic shocks. Nobody's denying that. But anybody with any knowledge knows that there's tension between number 10 and number 11, and policy is being made up almost on the hoof. I mean, you have to remember big tax rises. Only earlier this year, the Chancellor was saying otherwise. There's been tension. So I don't think this helps when it comes to currency markets. And I really think that there were some important lessons of the Blair-Brown government. They didn't like each other. They were political rivals, but there was serious predictability in economic policy making.
A sort of question of what the priorities are, isn't it? I'll leave you with this quote. Timing is from the analyst at Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. Timing is everything, but we are clear in our own minds. Sterling is no longer the doyen of foreign exchange markets that investors think it is.
Well, it's still tradable. I mean, remember, even though we've only got 3% of world GDP, we have 10% of foreign exchange trading. So that's good. But the thing is, at the moment, it looks a bit like a one-way street with dollar strength, and it doesn't look good for sterling.
Lionel Barber, many thanks indeed. I now have a much better understanding of why it is important and bad that this story has been underreported. Lionel, of course, former editor of the Financial Times and author of a rather wonderful volume of diaries, The Powerful and the Damned, covering his years in the top job at the FT. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We were going to talk a bit about airports. We are still. I think it's a really interesting story, but I don't want to leave the politics alone just yet. I want you to tell me why you think they're moving now. All right? That's the crucial question. So you can do it by pretending you're one of them if you want. If you were a Conservative MP, would you be submitting your letters? But why are they doing it now when, for my money, there's at least 10 worse offences than the partying at Downing Street? 3 minutes after 11, and I mean, literally during the news bulletin, I was sent a picture from Terminal 2 at Heathrow where, I mean, the scenes are astonishing. And I don't know if we've brought them to life properly yet. There are arguments about what is causing this astonishing catalogue of chaos and cancellations. There's one for the alliteration fans. It's a catastrophic catalogue of chaos and cancellations. And there are two ways into this, aren't there? There's the lived experience. There's what is actually going on the ground. And then there's the whys and the wherefores of it. And then possibly there's even a third strand here, which is people who work in the industry. Because I'm already hearing, and the plurative anecdote is not data, but the tales I'm hearing of staff at airports quitting on the spot. I mean, literally becoming so overcome by the workload and the stress that they're just walking out. They're just, up with this, they will not put. And all three of those angles I'd like to explore now with your help. Why is it happening? There isn't going to be a single answer to this. There are queues and problems in other airports in other countries, for example, so it's certainly not all going to be layable at the door of Brexit, although if it is linked to staff shortages in particular, then the abolition of freedom of movement is unlikely to have helped in that area. But I also heard from a lot of people during lockdown who were unhappy about the way they'd been treated by their employers, and those employers were often airlines. So that would be airlines rather than airport staff, ground staff, baggage handlers and other workers. So why? If you work in the industry as a pilot or as ground crew or as stewards or stewardesses on airlines, what in your mind is crystal clear? And don't worry about stating the bleeding obvious. Sometimes the rest of us need a little bit of help seeing the bleeding obvious, and I can do it numerically as well as rhetorically, so we can keep track of the tally, if you like, of what reasons you're giving up. So if you work in the industry, or are associated with it. Talk to me about your understanding of the scale of this chaos. Because, I mean, for example, the Telegraph suggests that holidaymakers arriving at airports 5 hours early have been blamed for causing widespread delays and queues. I don't know that I quite understand how that works. If you turn up 5 hours early, are you really bearing responsibility for delays and queues? I mean, more than you would do if you turned up 3 hours later? I don't know. It's on the list. This is Bristol Airport saying travellers were showing up before check-in and security gates were open, which added to the congestion. Really? And if the gate's not open, what you still? I don't know because I'm not working at Bristol Airport. If you are, you can help. Airports across the country now are facing the busiest week of travel since before the coronavirus crisis, with about 300,000 customers expected to fly out of Bristol alone over the half-term and Platty-Jubes period. And something is going horribly wrong. What and why? 0345 6060 973. One flight to Gatwick was diverted to Luton when the crew said they would run out of fuel after being given a later slot than expected to land at Gatwick. You've also got incredibly long queues, one of which I've just seen at Heathrow and Birmingham airports. Manchester said in a statement that ground handlers and airlines are experiencing challenges that are leading to delays at check-in and baggage reclaim. And on it goes. Now, I don't want to sound unsympathetic or unkind, but this is half-term. This is half-term in summer term. This is not a surprise. This is the week in which many, many families, it's the first time in years that we're not going away. Many, many, many families avail themselves of the opportunity to fly somewhere else. So I can't see any case at the moment for defending the notion that they didn't see it coming. So why? I'm putting that on the list of things as well. I don't think really, despite what Bristol Airport have said, that holidaymakers arriving a bit early is going to have made a major impact, although Bristol's quite a small airport. How could they not have known this was going to happen? And then you get perhaps into the nitty-gritty of it, because they did know it was going to happen, and they did know that they needed more staff, but not for the first time on this programme. And I don't want to put words into your mouth. Not for the first time on this programme. It will be perhaps a simple case that there are not enough bodies to fill the spaces vacated. And I'd like to know why you think that is, particularly as someone who works in the industry. How can there be staff shortages? Are we not paying enough? Have people become disillusioned with the industry? Did layoffs and furloughs and the rest of it during lockdown punch some fairly enormous holes in the entire infrastructure of the flight industry and the airport industry? 0345 6060 973. And if that's the case, and this, I think, just doing what I sometimes do before I open up the phone lines, collecting all the things, all the observable phenomena that I can, seeing all the things that are clearly in front of me, I'm led to this question now. It's all very well us writing about, catastrophic catalogues of chaos and cancellations. It makes for a lovely headline. What if it was unavoidable? What if it was unavoidable? What if this is, and we've touched on this a few times on the programme, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm a little bit wary of this subject because, well, at risk of sounding silly, I don't want it to be true. But we touched last week, didn't we, upon the fact that when Boris Johnson starts boasting about the employment market, we should probably start worrying about the state of the employment market. I think that's a fairly reliable response to a man whose relationship with the truth is, absolutely non-existent. And Boris Johnson started boasting a lot about the employment market, which made me think, what's the real story here? Yes, we've got very low unemployment, but we've got epic numbers of vacancies. I think the highest number of vacancies since records began. Now, let's just imagine for a moment that a fraction of those unfilled and perhaps unfillable vacancies are in the airline sector, then this becomes actually unavoidable. So it's all very well saying they should have seen it coming. But what if they did see it coming and there's simply nothing they can do about it? Then I'm left with a question, which again I think only people in the industry can answer. Why are they cancelling the flights? Why are they cancelling the flights Sound like Hyacinth Bouquet then. Why are they cancelling the flights? Why are they cancelling the flights so late in the day? So you see there's a lot going on here. So and I'm just speaking to you cold and live, so don't feel you have to have a better understanding of the issues than I do to join in. But I'm very interested to hear from people who are in the industry. My early analysis of this would be, if you were to hold a gun to my head and say, James, what's going on, would be this. They knew it was coming, and they knew they couldn't do much about it. So they kind of just crossed their fingers and hoped that everything would run as smoothly as possible, and that significant staff shortages would not come into play in a worst-case scenario kind of way. So they were kind of taking it on trust. And if things go horribly wrong, we'll be having to cancel flights on the actual day that people are expecting to fly out, which leaves one gap in my understanding. And that is what's gone horribly wrong that created this collection of circumstances to deliver, for the alliteration fans, the catastrophic catalogue of cancellations and chaos. Are we clear on that? It's 03456060973. And then eyewitness only, I think, airport testimony. What's actually going on the ground. So by eyewitness, I don't mean you actually have to be there now. But, all right, listen, let's just be friends for a minute. We've all been on holiday, or almost all of us have been on holiday. Most of us have been on holiday by aeroplane. I appreciate not absolutely everybody has. But you've got so much riding on that, right? I'm off on Thursday and Friday this week because of Platty Jubes, and I'm already waking up in the morning yesterday and today thinking, oh, it's a 3-day week. I can have a lie-in on Thursday. I don't even get up that early. But we factor in, I think, to our mental health or our mental equilibrium at least. Holidays have a huge heft, don't they? They are genuinely and almost literally the light at the end of the rat race tunnel. And you get to the airport and you have that little bit of, do you do this, or is it just, it can't be just me? There's always a bit of nervousness. I always get on the girls' nerves because I'm like, can we go now? Can we go to the gate now? And they're like, I just want to pop to WH Smith, or I'm just going to go to Pret a Manger. And I'm like, no, I really want to go to the gate. And on one or two occasions in the past, we have been late, and it doesn't seem to matter. I get really nervous going on holiday because I'm terrified that something's going to go wrong. And I've got so much riding on getting away, particularly when I'm going to somewhere that I already know and love. And I'm dreaming it in my head, and I'm thinking about it. And oh man, to have that snatched away from you at the final sort of hurdle without really knowing why or what's going on, I hate that. I think that must be awful. So that's what I mean by eyewitness. People who've been hit hard by the chaos and cancellations at airports this week. And I don't want to say ideally because that sounds a bit weird, but even perhaps today. All right? Phones will be very busy on this, but we will endeavour to answer all of your calls, and the ones that are closest to what I'm asking for will go to the front of the queue. So don't hold back if you don't immediately get through. People in the industry, what's going on? People outside the industry, what's happened? 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. It's coming up to 11:15. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It is 16 minutes after 11. There is chaos and cancellations at airports. I would like to know why. And it is not, to begin with, confined to UK airports, although the scenario here seems to be worse than it is in many other places. Let's dive straight in. Tim's in Swindon. Tim, what can you tell us?
Hi there, James. First time caller, or first time with you. Big fan of the show.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Right, I'm cabin crew with what used to be the world's favourite airline, and I'm on my way to work. So I just had to pull in so we can chat. It's a multitude of problems. Brexit obviously is a major factor because, as you alluded to earlier on, there just aren't enough people applying for the jobs.
But that's true in other countries as well. I think France has got staff shortages too. I mean, this is the problem with Brexit, isn't it? Is that you show me a problem, I'll give you Brexit. The problem gets worse, but it won't necessarily have created the whole problem in the first place.
No. The other thing though is two things.
Yes.
With all the laying off of thousands of the crew before or as the pandemic hit. They put them onto furlough and they put them into a pool. Now, the legacy crew, which would have been the crew who'd been there for a long, long time, we were all on very good pay.
Yeah.
And the problem is they put some of them in the pool, those that wanted the opportunity to perhaps come back when things picked up.
Yes.
But instead of being on the pay that they used to be on, they're coming back on £17,000 a year, whereas they used to be earning probably £40,000 to £50,000 a year.
Just talk me through that, will you, for a minute? Because that's the first I've heard of this. And I thought that furlough had allowed companies to keep their workforce on a low simmer, as it were, before it was time to turn the boil back up again. So
that did apply during furlough.
Yes.
But once furlough ended and they wanted people to come back, they started recruiting externally, but they also offered the opportunity to people who had put their name in the pool after furlough. So during furlough, people were getting 80% of their pay, and most of them had other jobs, so they were earning more than they would have been if they'd been flying.
I heard from people doing that, yes.
Yeah. But the deal when you came back was that you wouldn't come back on any of your terms and conditions, because we're all on new terms and conditions, and we're on new pay.
Now, and was this sold to you? Sorry to be thick, Tim, because remember, you're living this and I'm just learning about it, so I'm going to... So was this sort of served up as an emergency? But look, the industry's taken such a kicking, we're all keen to get back in the air, but you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to... What if you just said no? What if you said, I'm not coming back on 17 grand, I want my 40 grand? What would have happened to you then?
It just wouldn't have been an option to do that.
I didn't think you could do that. I mean, what about employment law and protections? They can't just... If I came back from lockdown, I mean, I worked throughout, but if I'd been put on ice for a couple of years and I came back and they said they were paying me considerably less, and if I was a member of staff, a PAYE member of staff, I don't think they'd be allowed to do that, would they?
Well, I think it's primarily because we were historically two fleets.
Was this the fire and rehire scandal that popped up? Is it linked to that?
It's kind of linked to that,
right.
Except we now have... we don't have... Those of us who've been there for a long time don't have any contracts, but we've had variations to our contract.
Okay.
Those who were on the lower pay, we've now merged and become one fleet.
Right.
And that new fleet now has a new contract and a new agreement.
Okay.
Which we've had to accept with unions' approval. But that does now include different pay structures for anybody who comes back into the airline.
Right.
And that will include the people who were in the pool.
I understand. So a lot of people have just walked away then, presumably?
Well, yes. Now, some have opted to come back, but on those terms and conditions, which are so inferior to what they had previously, they are not coming back. And I'll give you one other example. British Airways have set up a new Eurofleet out of Gatwick. It's called Euroflyer. Yes. It only began in March. The new entrants their starting salary is now £14,000.
Shucks.
Now, people cannot live on that kind of money. And I have it on very good authority that since March, crew who've left other airlines to come and join the world's favourite are already leaving because the pay is so appalling. And I think that's got a lot to do with why people are leaving.
So there are just huge holes in the... So there's a short... I mean, it seems to me counterintuitive. If you're struggling to attract staff, then... the most basic rules of capitalism and supply and demand suggest that you make the vacancies more attractive to fill.
Exactly. And this used to be a job that a lot of people would have loved to have done. The opportunity to see the world, travel around. The less attractive they make it, then the harder it's going to be for them to attract.
I don't know if you were listening on Friday, but we stumbled on Friday across a growing phenomenon of people in their 50s who are just not... They've had a bit of a rethink during lockdown and reprioritised, completely recalibrated, but it's not going to be confined to people in their 50s. It sounds as if some employers are creating an environment which, if you can walk away, you will, but they're banking that not enough people will be able to, so they'll be able to keep the tills ringing.
Exactly.
Oh, boy. Exactly. Final question. Why are they being cancelled so late? Because they must have known a week ago or a month ago that they weren't going to have the bodies to do everything that they've signed up to do. So why do these cancellations kick in so late?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that the likes of EasyJet have been doing that. I don't believe that BA has.
Okay.
My understanding is that their cancellations are planned and they are letting people know well in advance. We are getting some bad press, but I think a lot of it is unfair.
Yes.
And I don't think BA is as bad as some cancelling as like last-minute cancellations like some of the other companies are doing.
No, well, we'll find out, and I hope you're right, because, that will be good news to some people listening, but bad news to those who've booked with perhaps different airlines. Tim, take care, drive carefully. Thank you for pulling over to talk to me. I mean it when I say I want to speak to people who have got, very close connections with the subject under discussion, and this is a perfect example to that. It's not just cancellations, of course. There are delays as well, and the bank holiday weekend. It's a 4-day bank holiday weekend that is almost upon us. The Times reports that ministers have been urged to intervene to prevent trips being ruined, but short of sticking Jacob Rees-Mogg on a plane, serving gin and tonics and tomato juices, what could ministers meaningfully do in these sort of situations? Last night, a government source inevitably blamed the aviation sector. Instead, the sudden cancellations of flights and airport delays are completely unacceptable, the source said. The simple fact is that airlines and airports overcut staff during the pandemic, ignoring the fact that the billions of pounds of aid handed out by the government was meant to protect those very jobs. And Tim's contribution, I think, musters some sympathy for that position offered up by the government, is that the airlines have not seen the help offered up and not seen the furlough period in particular as a period of sustaining aid in the hope of sustaining the industry. They've seen it in the pragmatic short term, some of them, and now they're reaping what they sowed. But that doesn't answer the question of why the cancellations are happening so late in the day when the holes in the workforce would be evident at the beginning of a week. Paul's in Ramsgate. Paul, what can you tell us?
Hiya, James.
Hello,
we didn't have a cancellation, but about 10 days ago, me and my wife got on to go out to Alicante.
Yes.
We've got a property there that we now can't live in because of Brexit, which is another story.
I wish I could read you some of the texts telling me it's got nothing to do with Brexit, if that's any comfort to you, Paul. Carry on.
But we got to Gatwick on the advice of EasyJet to leave and get there 5 hours before. So we did. We got there 5 hours before. And very stupidly, it occurred to me that because they're asking us to get there 5 hours before, that the check-ins would be open. So we stood there with our packages, cases, etc., to be told by numerous EasyJet staff, oh no, your check-in doesn't open until 2.5 hours before the flight. Yeah. So we waited and waited and waited. And eventually, after probably an hour of queuing, we actually got to the check-in staff member, and she said, oh, you could have actually come now because all the flights are open. So the communication between their own staff was absolutely abysmal. When we got on the flight, the only things that were available to actually buy were a can of beer at £6 or whatever it is, and a small bottle of Prosecco at £7, and no duty free. On the way back was exactly the same. I think all they had to eat was a chocolate bar, and the announcement came on. The reason was because they couldn't staff the duty free or the bars or anything because of lack of staff. And it was a shambles. Arriving at Alicante was exactly the same. It was a shambles. It was just a nightmare, and it really sort of took the shine off of going away.
I'm sorry to hear that. At least you got away. I mean, it says scant consolation, but plenty of people, of course, are not getting away. They're getting cancelled rather than delayed. Just help me out with one thing, will you? Because this probably isn't very interesting to anybody else, but why were you queuing before? Was it just because the queues were so long and so busy you thought you may as well get in it even though the gate wasn't open for a while?
Well, no, we purely joined the queue. I spoke to a couple of other.
You can say because I'm British, James. There was a queue there, so I joined it.
Well, there was no option. It was the usual snaking queue, but without the little bits of red nylon. The nylon cord. Being British, we queued up, but everyone had received similar emails. Get to the airport 5 hours before. I went without sleep that evening. I was out playing a disco and got in the van and drove up there. Okay. But as it turned out, we could have gone straight through. But then when you actually got through to the departure lounge at Gatwick, every overpriced food establishment, which obviously all of them are, every single one of them had queues, and it was almost as if people were queuing up to pay over the top for a Cornish pasty.
Yes.
And we were quite hungry because I'd been up and hadn't eaten, but the queues were phenomenal, and every single food place that was open at that sort of horrible time of the morning, which is about 4 or 5 o'clock.
Because people are there for much longer than they expected to be, or people were turning up. Take a packed lunch. It might sound like silly advice, but goodness me.
Well, we did. We actually, that's exactly what we did. But I say some easy staff were armed with the correct information, namely the baggage check-in is open now. But I spoke to 3 different members of EasyJet staff, and they said, "Oh no, the check-in won't open until 2.5 hours before your flight." So it was a complete mixed bag of mixed messages from different people at EasyJet, I'm afraid.
And finally, the flight back. What was the situation at Alicante Airport on the flight back?
The flight back was at a pretty hideous time in the evening, and to be honest,
but you knew that when you booked it. What was the what was the state of play at the airport?
It actually wasn't too bad. It was pretty standard in all fairness. I mean, the queues weren't as bad. The main queues at Alicante were going into the airport, but no, coming back wasn't so bad. Apart from the fact that there wasn't much available to eat. But in the scheme of things, with things going on in the world,
you like your grub, don't you, Paul?
I do. I absolutely do.
I do too. I actually quite like airport and even aeroplane food. I think it's almost getting you in the zone. It's getting you in the holiday mood. But goodness me, the queues can be so dispiriting, can't they?